All right. Paul, I see you. Sharon, I see you. Let's give others a minute. We are live, by the way.
Hello. I was accidentally live a moment ago.
All right.
I managed to find my way backstage again. So.
All right. I think we have everyone. All right. Cool. So let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this first session today. Our session is the future of pharma, IoT, and emerging technologies. And just on a technology point, I know that some of us are having trouble with their network today. So if some of us do drop off, we will join back. Just hang around, and it'll resume. All right. So let me get started on the main topic itself. So welcome to the roundtable. We have a very good panel over here with a very diverse background. We have leaders who have worked in clinical pharmacology, digital transformation, regulatory affairs, strategic projects and business transformation, and of course IT. I expect with this diverse background that we can have a very healthy discussion about all things digital and emerging technologies. And before I jump into the core topic, let me just quickly do introductions. I will briefly introduce myself, and then maybe we'll just quickly go around, let everybody introduce themselves. My name is Vishal. I am the Chief Product Officer and founder of Mariana. Mariana is an AI software product company with a focus on enterprise AI products in manufacturing, digital supply chain, and unstructured data. Our manufacturing data hub lays the essential data foundation and utilizes machine learning to power smart factory capabilities, such as digital twin, batch genealogy, real-time release, continued process verification, and multivariate analysis. This results in improved operations, reduced waste, and improved yield. Now that I have that out of the way, let me start asking the panelists to quickly go around and introduce themselves. Sharon, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Sharon Roth. I am a director of the Bioanalysis, Genomics, and Biomarker Research Group at Otsuka Pharmaceuticals. My main function is to support the measurement of concentrations in biospecimens, both to support PK analysis as well as for biomarker research, and have been heavily involved in the innovation activities at Otsuka that brings me here today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sharon. Welcome. Brendan, you want to go next?
Great, thanks. My name is Brendan Alexander. I work for Sanofi. I'm the Associate Director of North America Engineering and Strategic Projects, which is a mouthful, I understand. But essentially, I support the R&D groups of Sanofi to help them deliver space focused on major capital projects. Right now, the consolidation of 8 sites into a single local headquarters.
Welcome, Brendan. Paul, you want to go next? Paul, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Hi, my name is Paul Drulak. I'm with Genentech Roche, part of the Roche supply chain organization, and our group in particular is focused on delivering innovation from a technology standpoint to solve current business problems within the supply chain. Basically, we're exploring technologies that we're not currently taking advantage of today and applying those to business challenges primarily focused on the supply chain, the extended supply chain.
Wonderful, Paul. Thank you. Mike?
Hi, I'm Mike Benecki. I'm Senior Director of Global Regulatory Affairs at UCB. I'm located in North Carolina, and I'm a medical device regulatory expert, and what I do is I specialize in the area of digital clinical innovation. When our researchers want to put apps and sensors in clinical trials, I help them do that, or if we're putting apps and sensors in in commercial settings, we do that as well. Our primary interest is really digital clinical tools to measure neurological disorders, and hopefully we can measure seizures in a remote setting and stuff like that.
Oh, thanks, Mike. And Mike, maybe if you're a little louder, the audio would be a little better. See if you can make that happen.
Is it better now?
Sorry?
Is this better now?
This is definitely better. Yes, thanks. Satish, you want to go next?
Yep, sure. Hi, I'm Satish. I'm the director for e-commerce here at GSK. I drive the technology stack for all of GSK's B2B platforms, primarily the vaccines division. I've been focused on enabling our sales field to sales reps and the force on the field, trying to engage more with the HCPs despite COVID and trying to keep our sales going the way they're supposed to be. So it's been a rapid pivot on how we tackle selling and meeting our customers' needs. So it's all been about transformation. Prior to that, I've been working in e-commerce for a very long time, 17 years, I would say, multiple different verticals. And pharma, I used to work for AstraZeneca, leading their global API strategy and development teams as well. So focus primarily on technology, but geared towards solving business problems.
Wonderful. No, that's a great introduction. I'm glad that you guys did your own introductions, and I didn't have to basically do the introductions for each one of you. I would not have been able to do justice. Considering the topic that we have, what I see in our panel is we have a very nice mix of people who have commercial exposure, people who have supply chain exposure, clinical, R&D, regulatory affairs. I think this is going to be an excellent mix for a very nice open discussion on a topic that I think most of us are dealing with this on a daily basis. The way I see, this particular, let's say, space emerge, especially in context with pharma and emerging technologies, is definitely there is innovation in all of those, let's say, functional areas. On the commercial side, Satish, like you touched upon a few, right? I mean, even now with all the lockdown and stuff, access to the providers from a pharma industry perspective is getting more and more restricted, right? And getting the digital, let's say, touch points to the providers is becoming increasingly more important, right? People are, of course, taking advantage of telemedicine and robotic surgeries. These are the things that people will start delivering remotely, from a direct, let's say, patient touch point perspective. And these areas of innovation will continue to grow. From a supply chain perspective, Paul, your diverse, let's say, experience will come in handy in some of the touch points that we will have. We ourselves are engaged in a very big way in terms of the innovation in the manufacturing space, but supply chain is another critical space that is constantly innovating itself, in terms of basically making things available to people who, when they need it and, where they need it. So, your views on that would be extremely powerful and valuable. And Mike, from an R&D clinical trials perspective, right, and from a regulatory standpoint in terms of how the regulatory authorities are basically looking at this space and interacting with us in terms of adapting to this and making sure these technologies can be delivered. Your thoughts on those would be extremely welcome. And Brendan, last but not the least, in terms of how large companies, are currently thinking about, large capital investments for the future, which will deliver in a few years, but the investments have to be made now. I mean, you are living and breathing this right now. Your thoughts on those would be extremely good for us today in the discussion. So having said that, I won't take too much time. Let me start with the very first question. So in your standpoint, in your point of view, how is the digital landscape currently changing the pharmaceutical industry? Paul, why don't we start with you?
So, I think that from a pharmaceutical standpoint, there's a perception, and I come from outside the pharmaceutical industry. So I've spent most of my career in retail and technology supply chain space, in the IoT space, and have recently come to pharmaceutical. And I think there's a reputation out there for pharmaceutical to be somewhat behind other industries from a supply chain standpoint.
Yep.
And I think that has a lot to do with the cost of goods sold being significantly higher than other industries. I think that has to do with regulatory pressure and the complexity of the pharmaceutical supply chain. I think that with the emerging thought around supply chain process and the increasing importance of supply chain across industries, kind of merging with the advancement of new technologies, AI, machine learning, how those could be applied to advanced forecasting. I think there's an opportunity here for pharmaceutical as an industry to kind of leapfrog to an advanced position from the perception of being in kind of a behind position. And I think that with some of the advancements from a technology standpoint, we're exploring things right now that can make a huge impact on our supply chain and with our partners that we collaborate with in the extended supply chain that aren't possible in other industries just because of the cost of the product. Our product justifies investment in certain areas that are out of reach for other organizations. So I think that there's a merging of a couple of things that are really exciting. Advancements in technology that are happening very quickly. I think IoT is changing week to week. It feels like last year was very different in terms of capability than this year. That combined with an increased focus on digital transformation, specifically with the supply chain, I think is merging into a really interesting space.
No, wonderful, Paul. I think I echo some of your thoughts. I see the same thing. So while the high margins and COGS have been a deterrent in terms of innovation in the past, I think that will be the fuel for increasing speed of innovation right now in the present and in the future. I completely agree with you. Exactly. I see that every day today, right? So Sharon, over to you. In your space, from a clinical perspective and from an R&D perspective, how do you see this space evolve?
Yeah, I mean, clinical trials, the success of clinical trials really depends on the data that we collect. Mm-hmm. And the more data that we can collect, the more robust the analysis and the outcomes of those clinical trials. So really, I see one of the advantages of IoT and the advances in the field to be able to collect more data and to be able to analyze that data faster. One thing that I think is an issue in clinical trials and has come up in the last year or so is diversity. We aren't reaching the population in a diverse manner because of the way clinical trials are run. And if we can expand the technological advances to be able to include a broader population, then that can reduce that diversity or increase the diversity so that we can include different populations.
Yeah, wonderful. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I was reading the other day, even some of the monitors that have been trained, which you put on the fingers and it basically looks at your oxygen level in your blood. Especially, they became very popular during the COVID era, and looks like even they have a little bit of, let's say, miscalibration based upon the color of the skin because of the original, let's say, patient set or subject set that was used in order to train it. So your point in terms of the diversity is extremely important because all of these, are going to be used across the world. And the diverse set of, let's say, subjects that need to be in the play to create appropriate technology that is not biased in nature would be really fundamental in terms of becoming effective to solve, let's say, global problems. Mike, from a regulatory standpoint, how do you see this particular space evolve?
Well, it's kind of a challenge because the idea is the regulatory philosophy is balancing, you don't want to hinder innovation, but you don't want anybody to get hurt. And so it's kind of a trade-off. And just to give you kind of a feeling out there, I think there's like 400,000 apps or more out there today, health apps today, or sensors and, medical devices. And the FDA can't regulate everything, so they reserve their regulatory guns for pre-market submissions to maybe the top 200. And then so the other 390,000 things are you're on your honor to do no harm. And I think the issue is that, the idea is that, to put clinical technology into clinical trials, it's largely unregulated, but the idea is it's incumbent upon the study sponsor, like the drug company, to do no harm. So the idea is that, for example, for example, there was a couple of years ago, a non-regulated device like MyFitnessPal. It's just a calorie counter, it's a diary, and 150 million people got hacked. So it kind of it echoes the noise of cybersecurity plus accuracy. I think the other issue is that there's a couple of years ago, one of the highest apps on the Apple Store was some instant blood pressure app where it was kind of a cool app. You'd hold your phone to your chest and you put your finger over your camera flash, and it would use the microphone on the phone and the finger and then the pulse from the camera flash, and it would integrate and calculate a blood pressure, and it was sold as a consumer device. And I loved it because my blood pressure always read low, but when someone did a clinical study on it, they found that it always read low, and it was inaccurate relative to a blood pressure cuff. And essentially, the FDA didn't step in, but the Federal Trade Commission said, "Where's your data?" And they quick took it off the market. Stuff like that. So it's risk-based. And then the other thing is, I don't want to talk too long, but the idea is that, definitely with COVID and all that, we want to do more stuff remotely, and we want to do collect more data in a home environment, and that's where digital is coming into play.
No, Mike, you make a very valid point, right? I mean, the speed of innovation is fast right now, and so many things are happening in parallel all over the world. There has to be some way or form where people, keep tab on it, so that we just don't go run, in the wrong direction where people can start having adverse impact with all of this. And regulatory authorities absolutely
flexibility are two different things.
Yeah, and sometimes we lose sight of that policing is extremely important to ensure that the right things basically go out, because everybody is wants to basically commercialize their technology and get to the market as quickly as possible. But absolutely, that's great. So moving on to another question, a different question here, and this is I'll go to you, Satish, and then to you, Brendan. What do you see is the biggest IoT, let's say, use cases and opportunities in the areas that deal with in the next 2 to 3 years? And can you touch upon the complexity of data analytics and AI in this context?
Sure, absolutely. In my view, right, if you can't measure something, it didn't happen, right? Science says that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, right? So same thing with e-commerce or any sales in general. I'm talking more from a commercial perspective on how we adjusted to the market last year. So AI, ML, analytics, I mean, we spend so much time on analytics and prediction of what the customers would do, how the market conditions are impacting our sales patterns, where would our next demand be, which part of the country or the world would we see a spike in certain product needs. So you're talking about data that we capture over the years. You're talking petabytes and petabytes of analytics data from all the channels of sales we have put together, running through AI ML algorithms, trying to figure out what the next place we should be so that we're ready for this manufacturing process or the supply chain is ready to cater to that needs, right? So data has continued to play a critical role in what we do. Speaking of digital, right, Paul made a point that before I was not in pharmaceutical industry until 2019. I came from the direct to consumer market where everything moves very fast. And then I always thought, hey, pharma engines, these are big behemoths. It's like the Titanic. You can't even turn when you see the iceberg hit you. But the point is they are big for a reason, and they're slow because of all the other regulations that we have to go through. But guess what? 2020 COVID struck, and the pivot the industry made and how it embraced being digital, and not just talking about digital. Like, we're not talking about automating or digitizing processes, but actually embracing digital the way it needs to be, trying to change the way we work, right? And data played a very important role in that. Things like we pivoted from how do we enable our sales force to continue to interact with the HCPs when COVID brought lockdowns? Which regions of the country do we see that we need to focus more because our sales in those areas went down? Or which product is suddenly spiking up? Is it because people are stockpiling it, or is it because there's a genuine increase in demand? All of these were driven by data and analytics that we collected over the years. How much did we see in sales for last 6 months versus the previous year, the same period? You're talking about really analytics driving our day to day for over a year and a half, even through COVID right now.
No, wonderful, wonderful, Satish. And Brendan, any thoughts?
Yeah. So, in my in my aspect, we're really looking at analytics in terms of, okay, how much does a piece of equipment get used? How frequently does a lab space get access? How often do we need to resupply these just general consumables? Each piece of equipment, each lab, each consumable takes up a space, and every square foot costs a lot of money in labs. And so all of those things we need to justify, provide the business case behind it as to, okay, why do we need that new piece of equipment? How long is it being used? Which groups are using it for what duration? If we're looking to invest another, $750,000 in a new instrument, are we only using the old one 40% of the time? How do we maximize those so that we're optimizing both the use of space and functionality of the equipment? So those are the big items at the moment, especially with the consolidation of sites we're working through right now. Is how do we do more with less? And all that comes down to is are we fully optimizing what we have now? Can we reduce the number of freezers that we have? If we have 700 freezers and in total only 60% of them are at capacity, how do we organize and optimize that so we're not wasting energy, wasting money? Where are we seeing things come in and be utilized, and can we proactively manage potential downtimes? Because we're monitoring the power, we're monitoring the functionality of those pieces so that we know ahead of time, look, this is starting to act abnormally from its trend data for the past 6 months. Maybe we need to get in there and do some maintenance. All these things are really critical to the delivery and functionality of these labs. And all of that drives back to the business case, because if we can't justify why we're putting that sensor on, if we can't justify why we're looking at those numbers, then yeah, it's great information, but if it's not saving money in the end, what's the point? On the R&D side, everything is sunk cost. We're not making money off R&D until it goes well beyond. So we really have to be thoughtful in where we're spending that capital and how we're making those investments so we get the best utilization of that funding to progress the science. Because at the end of the day, making sure we're progressing the science effectively and efficiently is what drives the future growth of the business.
No. So Brendan, I think you hit upon some very critical points that from a process of innovation, people don't necessarily think about it, right? I mean, in the end, what needs is capital investment and longer term investments that have to be done upfront in a very thoughtful way. That will drive innovation and will drive, let's say, cooler technologies and adoption in the future. And usually, it's a big struggle. And while we all basically run our daily jobs trying to take care of things and, let's say, fighting for the same budget and making a business case in why we think where the next set of, let's say, capital investments should happen, they are like a very critical thing in terms of a daily execution that people have to do in order to drive innovation. And in that theme, nobody, I think you are very well positioned in terms of basically sharing with some of us in terms of what those challenges are in terms of getting after this budget. How do you see within your organization, the point of view change in terms of how their willingness to basically start, let's say, investing in some things that do not necessarily have a very assured return, after, it basically materializes? How open are people now compared to, let's say, a couple of years back?
I would say it's been a challenge, and it will continue to be a challenge to justify that funding, and pulling teeth to get more money to do what we feel is right, but may not be justified for another 6 months, 12 months, the return on investment there. So it's certainly still a challenge right now, given the COVID world we're living in. I think from various levels of management, they're more open to those considerations because they're forced to. Frankly, they can't have everything the way it was. It has to change. So it puts more pressure, on that senior leadership to make those decisions about how can we, and making sure we're still remaining flexible. Research and development. Look 6 months in the past, you're 10 years ago, essentially. So everything changes so rapidly. You need to be flexible at the same time, even with these large investments. So, going through justifying the business case through small pilots, sample programs, things like that, to really help build the use case is what's been the most successful. But getting the overall stakeholder alignment to get even that initial pilot from the IT group to the R&D group that's spending it, but it needs support from IT, R&D, regulatory, making sure we're doing everything, quality, validation, all these things have costs sunk into them. So making sure you get everyone on board, headed in the right direction is a challenge. But, I think people really open their eyes over the past year to the opportunities that it presents as well.
Wonderful.
I think that could be an IoT project in and of itself, just to be able to get senior leaders of a company to be able to communicate on the same page and all have access to the same information.
Now you're talking about nirvana, Sharon.
And further to Brendan's point, and this is the experience that we've had, I would argue that the business case is broadening, especially when we look at IoT and some of the capabilities that enables. And, as an industry, I think that, focus on the patient is becoming more and more critical. Cost to society is an issue that's in the newspaper every day, and it's something that has to be, worked on and addressed. And so when we look at, how do we collaborate more closely with downstream partners? How do we collaborate and improve access to the patient? How do we improve patient safety? Some of these things have an ROI, and we're going through this process right now. We've got initiatives that have a concrete, tangible ROI that justifies the investment in a particular project, but that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it to advance various aspects of our relationship with the patient. And so when you put those two things together in the business case, you don't necessarily need a positive ROI or a hugely positive ROI. You need an ROI plus some good reasons to do things. And we're trying to, I think, broaden how we look at the business case in some of what we're doing so that we can do the things that we should do.
So that's actually a really great point you made at the end, right, Paul? It's not always about the ROI. It's also about the patient many of the times, right? So there's an initiative I can't talk much more in detail, but we are going through an initiative where it's about how do we make sure that the drug that we sell to the HCPs reaches them in the right order, that, it's kept in the same temperatures that it's supposed to be, and even more so important with COVID now, but being in the vaccines space, we need to make sure the product is shipped at a certain temperature. It stays at a certain temperature range through the entire shipping process and reaches the customer at that same temperature. If not, it goes waste. So you're talking about, our carbon footprint going up if something goes waste. Patients not getting their medication on time if something goes waste. So how do we use IoT to make sure that's maintained? And even when it is actually stored in the refrigerator at the various clinics, is it being maintained at the right temperatures or the right conditions and humidity levels and stuff? So there's an initiative. There is no ROI in it, honestly speaking, because the cost of implementing it is far more than the business benefit we get. But it ensures us as a company, we're doing the right thing, making sure there's no wastage, making sure the product that the customers get is actually where it's supposed to be.
I just wanted to comment that some of the artificial intelligence machine learning algorithms are actually making themselves through the clinic. For example, there are algorithms that have been approved by the FDA to analyze, let's say, retinal images to diagnose diabetic retinopathy, or looks at head CT scans to diagnose stroke. I know we have a project underway at UCB that I can disclose because it's in the public domain, is that what we're trying to do is, epileptics are on, a variety of epileptic medications, and there's a 30% failure rate. And the idea is that these people who develop drug resistance have bad clinical outcomes. And we're trying to predict the future, in effect, where from the time of diagnosis, we look at the data 1 year prior to the diagnosis, do our artificial intelligence machine learning algorithm, and we try to predict the future, whether we can predict the people who are going to fail the drugs quicker so people can intervene quicker.
Wonderful, Mike. That's great insight. Pulling the discussion back to a couple of important points that I think was mentioned in terms of ROI and, let's say, a partnership with the healthcare providers. On the partnership piece itself, right? As things are evolving, in your point of view, how are things, let's say, developing? For example, the real question I want to ask is, there are a lot of very big, let's say, technology players in the healthcare life sciences business trying to make a difference. We have investments from IBM, Microsoft, Google, coming into this particular piece, and they all want to make a difference over here. And from where you stand, have you seen any, basically, let's say, tangible outcomes from their investments? And are you guys looking at partnering with them from a larger ecosystem perspective in order to basically move some of these technology adoptions faster? Satish?
I would say, for example, if you look at it, right, when we were locked down and our sales reps couldn't go visit the HCPs, we still needed to engage with them. I think Salesforce came through at that point, and Viva Engage. We used Viva Engage extensively, rolled it out within 2 weeks across the country. And the fascinating thing was our HCPs were open-minded to actually accept a lot more digitization of how they interact with us, right? And you'll see that they pivoted going online a lot more than expecting a sales rep to be in the office all the time or at a certain amount of time to keep talking about product. So digital transformation happened. Digital transformation happened both sides. HCPs also became open to that, and the companies actually answered their calls too, right? And some of these large platforms came through. We use Microsoft quite a bit, and of course Salesforce and Viva Engage. They delivered, and I think this is where large companies have the necessary bandwidth to actually enable at a very short length, right? And same thing happened with the pharma industry. We were able to flex ourselves to get what we need.
No, that's a great response, Satish. In terms of all your commercial interactions, the way these large players are helping move the needle on a daily basis, that actually is pretty cool.
If I want to comment on that,
yeah, sure.
One thing is that, for example, UCB has a collaboration with Verily, and they make a research, a clinical study watch, which we're using it to perform exploratory endpoints, virtual motor exams on Parkinson's patients to see if we can use the watch to measure disease progression in a remote setting.
Right. Yeah, no, that's great. So, Paul, coming to you, digital supply chain. Exactly what is Genentech thinking about digital supply chain? How do they plan to basically move in the next couple of years in this particular space?
So I'm trying to figure out how to answer this question concisely because there's a lot that's in motion, as you can imagine. I describe it this way. We have kind of strategic structural initiatives. We've grouped those into 4 broad categories. Patient-driven supply chains, really about end-to-end collaboration, supply chain compression, things along those lines. Patient safety is what I think we're all engaged in on some level. Anti-counterfeit, advancing our anti-counterfeit initiatives and serialization in response to DSCSA. Next generation supply chain initiatives around advanced forecasting and basically introducing new tools and technologies that we are just beginning to take advantage of, AI, machine learning. And then finally, the fourth category is, kind of future-ready people. So how do we expand the concept of digital academy, bring technology knowledge to the broader workforce, bring academic inputs to our broader workforce, as well as industry expertise, and make that accessible. So those are kind of the structural categories. I would say we're also investing in more grassroots digital innovation and digital transformation. And this is where we're identifying the things that we, the four categories I just mentioned fit nicely into like a 3 to 5 year plan. There's things that are happening tomorrow that we're not aware of today. So we need to be active on the ground in terms of identifying new and emerging technologies and capabilities and bringing those in to solve current business challenges. So we have a bit of an opportunistic edge to our transformation initiatives as well. So we're kind of working down both those paths. And I would say some of the most interesting things that we're doing are coming out of that kind of grassroots digital innovation space. We're seeing things that wouldn't normally make it over the tall wall of pharmaceutical procurement, and so it's a good strategy to bring some new thoughts in. From an IoT perspective, I would say we're really trying to understand, and this is again part of our kind of next generation digital transformation from a supply chain standpoint, as well as more broadly, is establishing what our overall IoT strategy is. And we're looking at this in the context of facility, supply chain, and device. And those are all three very different applications, right? If you're talking about medical device, you have the regulatory hurdles, obviously. If you're looking at facility optimization, it's more a static IoT application. And then supply chain is something that's in motion. And we're trying to identify what are the commonalities across all of those different avenues we can go in from an IoT standpoint, and establish the structure and architecture to support all those kinds of things, as opposed to going at IoT initiative by initiative. And IoT is so broad, it's easy to get 15 different disconnected initiatives that may be solving the same problem. And that's what we noticed that we had a couple of years ago. We're trying to bring that together. So that's kind of what our digital transformation landscape looks like from both an IoT standpoint and a little bit more of a strategic standpoint.
Oh, there's lots of initiatives, Paul. And I know Genentech being a large organization, you can absorb some of them. But in terms of, everyone basically just continuing doing the daily job and then also taking care of all of these new technologies, new initiatives, and prioritizing them, what would be the top, let's say, 2 to 3, which you can see, really happening now versus, let's say, in another 4 or 5 years?
Again, in the IoT space, I think that what's happening now is there's opportunity in clinical in terms of adherence and automating some what are today manual functions. So I think the clinical IoT space has a lot of potential. Personalized healthcare is obviously becoming vastly more important. Cell and gene therapy, chain of custody, chain of identity is important, and IoT plays a role in that. So I think that's a little further out. And, I think last mile delivery. This is one of the things that, we're not ready to talk about yet, but we're putting a lot of effort into that potential. I think the industry has some room to go before it's really ready. But I think if you look at the outputs that could come from something like that, new information from new data sources on a huge scale that would in turn feed some of the AI and machine learning applications that are very data hungry. I think that's kind of a convergence that we're looking at over the next 3 3 to 5 years, maybe sooner.
Okay. No, thanks, Paul. Thanks for sharing that. Sharon, moving to you, what do you see as the key emerging technologies and innovation in clinical pharmacology and bioanalysis? I mean, your field, from where you sit, what are the main areas that you see emerging from an investment perspective?
Yeah, I think some of our focus is trying to make PK collection more friendly for the subject or the patient. Nobody likes to be stuck with a needle. Nobody likes to give blood, or at least I haven't met anybody. And so to be able to design procedures and data collection strategies to be able to allow innovative ways of collecting blood can really benefit the field. So there are some newer devices that have been developed to be able to collect blood. Some of them are actually finger sticks, so it still is like a lancet and a prick. Some are micro needles in which it uses a small vacuum to be able to extract the blood from the capillaries, which is tended to be painless. So these devices can be used in a self-collection mode. The collection to be done at home by a patient, allowing us to have that patient centricity. But how do you collect the data if a person is just collecting their blood? They don't necessarily care what time of day they collected it. They don't necessarily care if they had a meal and how many minutes prior to the collection that took place. So to be able to have technology that can automatically capture that data really is critical to the success of being able to perform these blood collections in a patient-centric way. Tech savvy, whereas the Generation Z is tech native. So they're expecting technology to be there. They're expecting technology to perform for them. So the clinical pharmacology space needs to be able to keep up with that.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Sharon. Moving to Mike. And again, Mike, you might have already touched upon this, but can you a little bit more elaborate in terms of when the time comes in terms of adopting some of these newer technologies from a commercialization perspective, interacting with the regulatory authorities, how have things changed in terms of making these part of the normal submissions and making this part of what is accepted today in terms of getting them through the regulatory authorities?
Yeah, that's a good one. So, I think the actual situation is there's a lot of digital and clinical trials, but a lot of it is playing right now that they're exploring. Very few trials have actually used the digital technology in a real, as a real endpoint in a clinical study. For example, there's one where I think there's a company called Bellerophon, and they have a drug for acute pulmonary hypertension, and it's inhaled nitrous oxide. And they actually, their major endpoint is moderate to vigorous physical activity as measured by a kind of a Fitbit type of device. So that's it. But really, the idea is that I think the challenge of making these things widely available, you almost have to do it in a consortium because the data is a lot to prove a general use case. I think it's very onerous for one company to do it. Usually one company really just does it in the context of a very narrow context of a clinical trial, and they can use it as a digital endpoint. But if you want to use, let's say, this technology to measure, stride velocity and muscular dystrophy drugs like, they do in Europe, it requires a consortium approach, and countries have to work in a pre-competitive space.
Okay. All right. And these consortium, you're seeing these are like existing alliances and consortiums, or do you see these consortiums evolve depending upon the nature of the work?
Like Transcelerate, is one consortium among the other one is the Critical Path Institute. They're moving. They're doing a clinical study to try to use digital technology to measure neurological disease progression.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Mike. Satish, over to you a question, and others can feel free to basically share their experiences as well. How important do you see, or how what is it that you see from a perspective of how people are basically experimenting rapidly and adapting the new technologies? How agile is that particular approach, and how open are people to basically fast failures and then moving on to the next thing?
Well, that's a great topic, actually. The philosophy of GSK's technology teams and some of the business as well, right, is VFQ, where it's all about experimentation, get result fast. It could be a failure, you learn and you move forward. So it's actually in our DNA at GSK, all the way from Emma down. So to make a point, GSK embraces experimentation at all levels of the organization. And now when you talk about technology in general, I think we have been changing and adopting digital so much since 2020, and we don't necessarily know what would work because the world as it used to exist has changed. So we don't really know which technology works and what, right? So experimentation has been really key for us to evolve and adopt what the market needs, as an example. So things could be newer data analytics tools, or newer customer engagement tools, or how we give technology to our HCPs and how they interact with us. How do we leverage data from what we learned through let's say, for example, during the clinical trials of COVID, while I was at my previous company, we used to take all the data and how do we harness that data and digitize it for regulatory approvals? Previously, we used to be a lot manual, and how did we make it fast enough? And so experimentation got multiple rejects, and then you finally get to that combination of technology and process, which is fast, clean, and efficient, but at the same time adheres to the quality standards set by FDA, as an example, right? So in my view, I worked in two organizations in 2020, half in one company and half in the other, but I see a common trait in both. It's okay to fail, pick yourself up, move fast enough so that what you just learned, apply it rapidly and get a new solution immediately.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for that, Satish. Anyone else wants to comment on that particular piece? I do see that we are getting some questions from the general audience, and I'll go and move to that. But on this particular piece, any other comments?
Yeah, I don't want to reveal too much, but I would say that it's much easier to talk about agile than it is to do agile. And we probably struggle with the same things that everybody struggles with. It's really compelling to talk about going fast and failing fast and moving on, and then it actually starts to happen, and you kind of have to go back and remember what you talked about at the beginning of a project, and kind of keep that agile discipline. And I think that's something that is important, is to introduce agile, accept it into your work process, and then continuously revisit it as you actually execute on agile.
Yeah, Paul, I completely agree. It's easier to talk about it than to execute it 100% on the mark. And I guess some of us who have been in this for long, also have a kind of a bias in terms of doing things the old way. I think there are some things that do lend themselves okay from an agile perspective, but others do not. My point of view, that is. Okay, so a couple of questions that I see from the audience. This one particular one: how do you see advanced analytics, AI, and ML changing the sector? Anyone?
I can take one, at least from the sales perspective, or the commercial aspect of pharma. And I could also answer part of that question during my stint at AstraZeneca, when I was driving a lot of the data integration, how data moves and how data access is enabled, right? So I'll start with GSK first. In my view, what we have done in the last 8 months would not have been possible without data analytics and using ML to predict where our next demand will show up, or how the consumption patterns of customers are driving the demand, right? For example, when COVID struck back in March of last year and things started shutting down and everybody was stockpiling on products, we had to go back to the prescription data and figure out, are these new customers or are these existing customers buying and stockpiling, so that we predict what our demand would be 4 months from now to adjust our supply chain accordingly. And that would not have been possible without machine learning algorithms using all the data we already had harnessed, as an example, right? And that learning has actually evolved and blossomed into a much more additional things that we are doing now based on market data, prescription data, customer behavior data, purchasing patterns, forecasting what we need to do this year in terms of manufacturing and supply chain availability.
One thing I could add to that is that, like I said previously, that AI ML algorithms are making their way into the clinic, and actually just last week FDA published a guidance on how they plan to regulate AI ML algorithms. And all I'm saying is that to date, the algorithms that went through FDA were optimized with machine learning, but then they were locked at time of approval by FDA, and now they're trying to do the next step where you get approved, but then your algorithm can continually learn, and they're trying to review your optimization protocol so you can continually keep improving your product after you analyze 1 million retinal images. Your algorithm will be better than when it just analyzed 100,000 images.
Right. Makes sense. Right. How do you ensure that the continuous learning is you're learning it in the right direction, and you're not basically learning some noise as well with it? And how do you prove that out before you basically put it out in a commercial application or in a patient impact related situation? So that makes a lot of sense.
I think, Vishal, what's happened is, right, the combination of AI ML with analytics has evolved a new term called predictive analytics, right, or predictive modeling. And I think pharma, at least in the commercial sector, we leverage that significantly now, figuring out how's the best time, optimize the assets and resources we have in order to deliver value for the customer and make sure their lives are simpler.
Right. No, completely agree with that, Satish. I mean, there is one aspect of it in terms of, let's say, the back-end operations piece and making it more efficient, making it more, let's say, patient-centric, making sure that they get what they need. But the other aspect of it is in the treatment of, let's say, subjects and patients. If you are using AI ML to continuously basically improve and learn, how do you guarantee that your continuous learning is basically learning in the right direction and not basically bringing in biases? I think so. So Mike's point on that one is on the mark. I think both these things have to basically go in parallel. There is no stopping it anyway. I have another question. Okay, here is a question from Hari Shesha. He's curious to know what is taken up first in the IoT standpoint. Is it manufacturing 4.0 or lab 4.0? Where is the industry trying to prioritize this? Anybody wants to take this?
I can answer some of it from my AstraZeneca days. Sure. I'll tell you can't really prioritize between a left eye and right eye, in my view, right? You can't manufacture if the lab's not smart enough. Think about how we do the research, right? I mean, products are... I actually did a lot of lab walks when I was in AstraZeneca because I used to lead the IoT strategy there, trying to understand how do we digitize the labs. The lab of future was a big deal for AstraZeneca. We were investing millions of dollars into it. But at the same time, I also did walkthrough of our production facility here in Maryland. And one of the biggest things was predictive maintenance. How do we make sure the supply, the manufacturing line doesn't shut down or the yield doesn't go down in bio stuff, right? Biopharma stuff. So it was very important for us to make sure both of the manufacturing side and the lab side were advanced in IoT at the same time. We had integrations of various weights, as an example, right? You're measuring the quantity of ingredients that are going into manufacturing a drug as part of R&D, and how do we take that and embedded it into our manufacturing process and monitor the same temperatures and same manufacturing conditions. So, long story short, I think both are equally important for the pharma industry, at least as of 2020.
Very nice. Anyone else wants to add anything from their experience in their organizations? Is there, let's say, partiality towards where people want to make investments first? Is it both, or is it opportunistic? I think we heard a little earlier.
Yeah, I think it's certainly opportunistic, but it's in both. Manufacturing and R&D have wildly different use cases and analytics and justification behind each of them. Whereas in the R&D, you have the opportunity to be agile and try things and fail. Manufacturing, you don't have that option. It's not let's just wing it and fail. That's not how it goes. But I think both use cases are certainly pushing the industry forward. They're just very different background to each of them.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul.
No, I was going to echo your point. That was exactly what I was going to say. Is the opportunistic element to IoT opportunities.
I do see Mark. Mark, we still have time?
There's 2 minutes left.
2 minutes. Okay, so let me take one last question. This one is around the challenges and risks. So it says, what are the biggest challenges and risks associated with IoT adoption as you see it? I think, Mike, you kind of hit upon this point a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that technology is moving so fast that the let's say the internal control framework to make sure the results are accurate and reliable and safe is struggling to catch up. I think that's my view on that.
Yeah.
There was another aspect I wanted to bring up, right? Once you capture the data through the sensors and trying to make sure that's accurate, actually transporting the data through secure channels to where it's supposed to be analyzed and using that data back to improve on the efficiency of the IoT devices, that was the biggest challenge we used to face. How do you securely transport the data without adding latencies? Because these chips and these sensors are so small, they really can't store data. You need to stream them live. And how do you do that two-way communication? Like, for example, most of the times the manufacturing facilities are off the grid, right? They are not connected to the internet. How do you take data from these sensors, send it to some analytics platform which is on the internet, safely and securely, and then send the results back to fine-tune it real time? That was the biggest challenge.
I'd say our challenges are similar, Satish, but we're looking at this from an internal and an external point of view. So the data security definitely from an internal point of view, but once we start to get external, that risk is exponentially larger outside of our four walls. And the other thing that we're looking at really closely and trying to understand, and it's a real moving target, is data privacy. So what data are you collecting, and at what point does that become a data privacy issue? And I think that the landscape for ensuring data privacy, especially at the patient level, is something that's evolving relative to IoT really quickly too.
Paul, can I add one thing about the patient privacy? That actually the regulatory, framework for patient privacy is fairly complex because Europe is much more stricter than the U.S. They have this general data protection regulation where they think we're relaxed in the U.S.
Yeah.
So just to summarize, I think what I heard was, of course, from a patient standpoint, safety and reliability, and from a data standpoint, the speed and handling of data, both from a security and a privacy standpoint, these remain, I guess, the primary challenges as we see it from an IoT and emerging technology standpoint. We are just over 1 minute. I think we have had a pretty good session here. I would like to thank all of you for making the time and attending this one. Mike, Satish, Brendan, Paul, and Sharon, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to all of us today, and looking forward to a great conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.